Hello and welcome to part 2 of this study into sex, sexuality and gender in the Old Testament. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at the introductory video and part 1. Part 1 was about Genesis and gender. If you missed those and you want to go back and have a look at them now, feel free to do so. Otherwise we'll carry on as we are. And today we're looking at Leviticus and the sex texts. Particularly we're going to be looking at those somewhat infamous verses of Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13. The New Revised Standard Version translates 18:22 as, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." And 20:13 it translates as, "If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them." The New International Version translates them as 18:22, "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable." And 20:13 it translates as, "If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." Now, we can immediately see that whilst the general gist of the translations are the same, even these fairly standard translations make very different choices about the details of what is being expressed in the Hebrew. And that's not just because these are difficult verses theologically, which they are, but they're also really difficult and messy in terms of the basic Hebrew grammar that's going on in those verses. So let's begin with some relatively simple things. For the Hebrew word shakav, the NRSV chooses lie with, whereas the NIV chooses sexual relations. The literal translation is to lie down. But there are many occasions when the verb is used euphemistically to speak about having sex. So the NIV is not technically wrong, but this is a choice of interpretation rather than of literal translation. Also in Leviticus 20:13, the NIV chooses to translate both ish and zakar as man, whereas the NRSV probably slightly more accurately translates them as man and male. Now this doesn't necessarily shift the meaning hugely within the sentence, but it might lead us to ask whether the difference between ish and zakar is intended to be meaningful in this situation. We might translate, for example, ish as husband or zakar in terms of masculinity, or remembrance, or progeny, or even something to do with male genitalia, all of which would significantly shift the meaning of this verse. In both verses, the word for woman is isha, the relational sense of woman or wife, rather than the biological sexual description of the word nikeva. This suggests that though this is a generalized rule, the woman who is the object of the sentence is already intended to be in some way in relationship with the subject of the sentence. This ought to have a significant influence on how we read the instruction. Note how neither translations opt for the choice of wife for isha or husband for ish, as both do elsewhere in their translations. Both verses refer to zakar, male, but neither mention nikeva, female. Leviticus 18:22 doesn't mention a man or a husband, only zakar as the object of the verb. Which brings us to some deeper translation issues with these verses. Both are missing significant parts of the grammar that we need to construct a normal English sentence. This is not hugely unusual in Hebrew, and it's part of what makes it a tough language to translate. But these are certainly some of the toughest sentences that I've ever tried to translate for myself. Often the meanings of such verses are easy to infer from the context. Often the ambiguity has very little consequence. However, in this case, I think the consequences are significant, and it is possible that we have placed a little too much confidence in our traditional readings of these verses. Leviticus 18:22 doesn't begin with a verb, as is usual in Hebrew, but with a word that either means with or simply signposts that the object of the sentence is coming next. But let's assume that the meaning here is with, if for no other reason than without it, the sentence becomes almost impossible to construct. It is the verb that tells us who the subject is, and whilst the verb is there, its position is peculiar. This is how Hebrew normally works. It would be, and not will lie you with male. But here in Leviticus 18:22, it's, and with male, not will lie you. Now there's a masculine you at the end of the verb, so the subject of the sentence seems to be identified as male. But we have no Ish, Adam or Zakar to give us a sense of what kind of you this really is. The NRSV brings the you to the front of the sentence, whereas the NIV keeps the you hidden by turning the verb into an imperative, by swapping the you shall not for a do not. Both fail to show that there is a masculinity expressed in these words, and there is perhaps some good reason for that. This is a general instruction, but it's addressed in the singular. And the default gender for Hebrew grammar is masculine. And so in a situation where there is a collective but singular you of undefined gender, the you would automatically be male and not female. There is a perfect opportunity for the writer to clarify the gender, as we see in Leviticus 20:13, but this option is not taken up in 18:22. And so, whilst there is no reason to believe that there is a specific intention to address both men and women in this verse, linguistically it makes sense to translate it as neutrally as possible. Now, this gender ambiguity perhaps should be taken with a pinch of salt in the light of what we hear in the next verse in Leviticus 18:23, where it says, "You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion." This seems to hint at the idea that all these instructions are primarily aimed at men, except when women are specifically addressed. Now that would seem to play to our expectations generally in Leviticus 18 sexual laws, and I'll explore that a little bit more later, both in this section and in another one. However, there are two problems that come up with this. Firstly, there are clearly many times in Leviticus when the generic male you would definitely also apply to women, such as Leviticus 17:14, "You shall not eat the blood of any creature," or Leviticus 26 verse 1, "You shall make for yourselves no idols and erect no carved images or pillars." Secondly, embrace yourself for this one, there is a very specific reason why women are particularly separated out from the men in Leviticus 18:23. The first generic you is addressed perhaps just to men or to men and women, because they are instructed simply not to shakav, lie down with animals. However, the women are specifically instructed not to ravah in the face of the animals. This is because ravah is a verb form of the number 4, and therefore fairly literally means getting on all fours. As a side note, this verse is also an illustration of the need to be cautious about gender assumptions in the Hebrew, as the animals referred to here are behemoth, which is a generic term for a herd animal or beast. The word is plural and feminine, but the graphic nature of the way the word is used in this situation somewhat rules out the possibility of this being a reference to an encounter with a female herd beast. Another question we might ponder with regard to the use of ravah in Leviticus 18:23 is why there is no specific word or any variation of ravah used for the sexual activity in Leviticus 18:22 or 20:13. A far more fundamental translation problem exists in both Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, in the way that most translations translate mishkaveh. The NIV and the NRSV replace it with as with and as one does with. In the Hebrew, words like kmo or just the prefix k would have done a better job in that situation. Mishkaveh is something very different. It means in beds of, or in the lying places of. Whilst it is quite reasonable to use this in the same euphemistic way as shakav, the euphemism doesn't quite land here in the same way we would expect it to. If the verse is saying a man should not lie with masculinity in the beds of women, already the meaning is beginning to collapse in English. In some ways, once we've made the assumption that this verse is about outlawing gay sex, it's hard to make sense of it with "in beds of" and "without" as one does with or as with. Even if we assume an unspoken sense of comparison within the sentence, the comparison would be uneven. To lie with male biological, like beds of woman relationship, it's not a like-for-like comparison. Whatever is being expressed here, it does not seem to be so simple as just replacing a female for a male in a sexual act. It's not hard to see why the translators have chosen to omit mishkaveh entirely in this situation, because until now the prevailing culture around us has had no particular reason to call into question our assumptions about these verses. If we were to read this phrase as something a little more like, "if a husband lies down with a male in the beds of a wife," then the meaning begins to look significantly different. If we dig deeper into the sense of zakah being more about sexual masculinity and isha being more about relationship, then there may be a greater sense of this being about causing irreparable damage to an established and fruitful relationship by bringing a strange man into the marriage bed, by engaging in a sexual encounter that can neither produce children, nor is it likely to encourage harmony in the marriage, particularly if these activities are happening without the wife's knowledge. If we look at the punishment that is meted out in the latter half of Leviticus 20 verse 13, it could also give a context to the alternative readings of the first half. Mot yumat or mot yumatu is a fairly common phrase, usually read as declaring a death sentence. It makes use of a grammatical trick that doesn't exist in English. It is the infinitive absolute, an unnumbered and ungendered version of the verb placed before another version of the verb to add emphasis. Often translators will show this by adding a surely before the verb. The King James Version uses this technique consistently, whereas the NIV uses it fairly frequently, but only once in reference to the death sentence in Genesis 26 verse 11. My own personal and somewhat unusual choice with the infinitive absolute is to invent some grammar in English that reflects how the Hebrew works, because English leaves some lovely spaces for cheating like that because of its messy complexity. And I like to explore how true to Hebrew I can keep before the English meaning is lost or before the English grammar is broken. So the verb mut means to die. So for the infinitive absolute, mot, I invented an adverb that doesn't exist, dyingly. Yumatu is fully conjugated as imperfect, loosely speaking, the future tense in Hebrew. It's plural and it's male. And it's in a thing called the Hoffel binyan. Now, we don't need to fully understand what binyans are at this point, but it's basically about who's doing the thing to whom and how. So in the Hoffel binyan, which is passive and causal, it means that the thing is being caused to be done to the subject of the verb. So my literal translation of mot yumatu would be, dyingly they will be caused to die. This means that they will be really dead, but there's no need for an object to the sentence. So it leaves space open for how that death will be caused. In a translation by a chap called Robert Alter, he frames this as, they are doomed to die. I quite like that choice. This leaves an interesting ambiguity which is worth exploring across all the uses of this phrase in the Old Testament. And it does beg the question of whether these laws are normally expected to be about execution or whether they are more about a spiritual sense of causality. As in, if you do bad things will happen to you. Now in Leviticus 20:13 we have the peculiar postscript of Damehem Bam, which in the NRSV is translated as, their blood is upon them. Damehem Bam is a phrase that is peculiar to Leviticus chapter 20 and is one that turns up 6 times after all who curse father or mother. A man who lies with his father's wife, a man who lies with his daughter-in-law, a man who lies with a male as with a woman, a man or a woman who has sexual relations with an animal, and a man or a woman who is a medium or a wizard. And all of these are doomed to die, or whatever version of that phrase we choose as the translation of Mot Yumatu. Now, the NIV curiously chooses to translate Damehem Bam as their blood is upon their heads. This is a phrase only found in Ezekiel 33 verse 4, Damo Barosho. It sounds a little like the more familiar phrase, Vadam Bidehen, blood is on their hands. This is also found in Ezekiel at 23 verse 37 and 45. Now, we might assume that the meanings of these phrases are the same, but they are potentially quite different. A slightly more literal translation of Damehem Bam would be, their blood's with them. Leviticus has a great deal to say about the spiritual significance of blood, particularly through its usage in sacrifice. Leviticus 17 verses 10 and 11 offer one of the clearest descriptions of the theological thinking behind these Levitical laws, when it says, I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among them who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar. For as life, it is the blood that makes atonement. According to Leviticus, the blood of a sacrifice should not be eaten because it contains the nephesh, the spirit or life force of the creature, and it is that blood which pays for or atones for the sins. Sin in Levitical thinking brings death with it, not simply in a scenario of legal retribution where the sinners are executed, but in a way that holds together the spiritual and the physical. It equates far more closely with the modern thinking of life points that you might find in a role-playing computer game. In such a game, you might get attacked by a monster and lose life points. Then you might replenish those points by resting, eating, or being healed. But if you lose too many points before you can heal, then of course you are dead. In the Levitical thinking, the more you sin, or the worse your sin, the more you lose life points, and the more you need to atone with the life points stored in the blood of the animal sacrifice. But you can't just steal those points directly by drinking or eating the blood. It has to go on the altar in order to be returned to God, so that God can restore those life points to you. So, to bring that metaphor back to the Damehem Bam, when certain sins cause you to die, it's not just you who dies, but the life points in your blood die too. 5 of the 6 Damehem Bam verses are about sex, but the last is about being a medium or a wizard. The Levitical thinking saw such activities as being a contamination of the purity of the blood of God's people, and something that would affect their bloodline in some way to the following generations. This is more obviously true of those verses about incest, bestiality, and perhaps deciding to sleep with someone who is biologically male instead of your chosen female life partner. There is a practical sense in which each of these affect your bloodline, in a culture and in a time where producing offspring is imperative for the survival of the whole community and for the remembrance of all those stories. Leviticus chapter 26 verses 3 to 9 speak of the rewards of being good, and the last verse particularly shows us the flip side of these sexual laws. If you follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them faithfully, I will look with favour upon you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will maintain my covenant with you. There is another incest verse in Leviticus where this point is made even more clear. Leviticus 20:20 says, if a man lies with his uncle's wife, he has uncovered his uncle's nakedness. They shall be subject to punishment. They shall die childless. Here and only here, the sexual law postscript Damehem Bam is replaced with Arariim Yamuto. A more literal translation of this verse would be, a man who lies with his aunt, the nakedness of his uncle he will uncover. Their sin they will carry, childless they will die. Again, this seems less about punishment in the earthly sense and more about natural and spiritual consequences in relationship to God's covenant promise. This theology is first expressed in reference to what people can eat. After Noah and his family come out of the ark in Genesis chapter 9, it says, God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. This passage then leads into the verse which we explored earlier in chapter 1, where we hear God speaking about the blood of Adam. It is at this point that God makes the first covenant with his people, a covenant rooted in the promise not to destroy this fledgling people, whom he has just encouraged to multiply and fill the earth. In Genesis 17 verse 4, we then see God making a covenant with Abraham that more explicitly defines it by promising, You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. We've already seen these covenant verses echoed in Leviticus 26 verse 9. We might say today that with 7 billion human beings on the earth and all the troubles that come with such a large population, that this imperative to spread across the world has now run its course. But even within the biblical text, we see a shift away from the promises of the old covenant towards a new one, and away from simple expansion of numbers towards quality of relationship. The call to be fruitful and multiply is echoed to both humans and animals in 11 verses of the Old Testament, but the shifting emphasis of the Old Testament is illustrated in part by the way that 7 of those verses are concentrated within the text of Genesis. The New Testament completes this shift away from the generational inheritance towards a personal inheritance and an eternal inheritance, and away from payment by animal sacrifice towards the sacrifice of Jesus for all people for all time. But that is theology for another time and another study. In the light of all that we have explored here, it stands to reason that the intentions of both Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 are more about the effect that these acts will have on a person's ability to have offspring, to maintain a strong and healthy relationship, and to continue their bloodline, than any sense of God having any particular concerns about different sexual orientations, not least because the word orientation does not exist in that language. And even that initial emphasis on reproduction shifts within the narrative of the Bible itself. I hope you've enjoyed studying these verses with me, and I invite you to join me again next time when I'll be looking at part 3, which I've entitled All the Girls and Boys. See you then.